Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about Starfield, 30 frames per second and ID soft. Now there's a lot of people complaining about Starfield only being locked at 30 frames per second, or will it be locked at 30 frames per second, and it bad if it's locked at 30 frames per second. And there's also talk of combat systems and whatnot going on. I've avoided this topic so far, but I thought I'd chime in now and just give you my take on the situation. Now, if you just brought a really big expensive graphics card and your game is locked at 30 frames per second, you might be a bit annoyed by it. If you brought a console and found it locked at 30 frames per second, you might expect it. Because if the game's graphics are set high, then your console's going to struggle with it. By locking it at 30 frames per second, what you get is a smooth game. The game doesn't judder or freeze. So locking at 30 frames per second, if the graphics and the settings and everything else are set high, is a balancing act. It goes between what you'd like to see the game look like versus what your hardware can cope with. If they said it's a 60 frames per second and your gameplay was like that, you'd soon complain. But if you said it's frames per second, your gameplay is smooth and you still get the detail, then you wouldn't complain. And this is the thing I think is happening right now. Bethesda have set their game standards a little bit higher than normal, and as a consequence, they need the frames per second to be consistent. But if they said it's a 60 frames per second, which is what they did with Skyrim, they locked it at 60, instead they lock it at 30, they guarantee a minimum performance, or the best performance they could get on consoles. On PCs, I think it'd probably be locked at 60 again. But what does locking it at 60 or 30 actually mean in real terms? Well, for starters, your graphics card or your graphics chip uses less power. It doesn't need to draw loads and loads of power just to run the game. So it becomes a really low voltage game. That means your energy bills are going to be a bit cheaper. It also means your system's going to run cooler. Because if you push your system to its absolute limits, it's going to run really hot, which slowly damages your hardware. If you run it for an hour or two, fine. You run it for 6 or 7 hours, not so fine. Eventually, if you get hot weather in the summer or something like that, your system might your screen might go weird and that'd be it. Dead console or dead graphics card. So keeping it cool is a good way of ensuring the safety and the longevity of your hardware. So 30 frames per second does all of that. It keeps the frame rate in a playable level without making it overly hot, and whilst making it, the gameplay smooth and decent. You get the graphics you want, you get the gameplay you want, no real downside. Now, frames per second, when it drops to 20, you start to notice. At 30, you don't really notice. At 30, it's not as good as 60, but it's still quite good. If you're running a console, not a PC, then I have to say, well, it's to be expected. Because our consoles are designed to be cheap mass production things, fraction of the price of a PC. So you can't expect PC performance on them. On the other hand, they do let you play a lot of games that the PC has. So you win-win, cheaper, and you still play the games. The drawback, as I said though, is everything costs less. As a consequence, the performance is less. So frames per second is set at 30. Now, if we look at ID soft, there was talk of ID soft helping out with Fallout 4. There's talk about ID soft helping out with Starfield. Now, who are ID soft? Well, they made Doom, Quake, them kind of games. They were really big in the early days of the 3D shooters. They made a lot of firsts. Unreal came along, kind of took over from that, with the first Unreal game. But ID Soft were pioneers. They've since been brought out by Bethesda, who've been brought out by Microsoft. So they're still on the same team. They're sister companies. And now they helped with this Starfield, shooting scenes and things like that. And they're experts at that kind of thing. They're really good at making shoot 'em up games. So to have them on board in Starfield means the action scenes should be good. We already see some of that in Fallout, say in Fallout 4. But in Starfield, remember, Starfield is also an RPG, so it's not just an empty world full of pretty visuals and lots of bad guys to shoot. There's lots of interactive objects in it as well, which will slow the game down a little bit. So you can't have massive frames per second and have the detail where you can interact with parts of the world. You have to give something up. Frames per second is what you give up, which brings us back to the 30 frames per second topic again. Now, people who shoot is normally like as many frames per second as they possibly can. But Starfield isn't just a shooter, it's an RPG. And this is the thing to remember. A role-play game has more detail in the world, more interactive objects. It is going to slow down a little bit. It is going to require more CPU time and more graphics time. A shooter is just a pretty world that acts as a backdrop while you kill AIs. That's it. You know, there isn't the massive difference between the two. It's a bit like saying, look, I've got a shopping basket with one tin of beans in it, and I've got another shopping basket with several tin of beans in it. One's going to be heavier than the other. It's the same here. RPGs take up more system resources and will run slower, period. A lot of this talk about frames per second being bad and stuff like that is really coming from people that clearly don't understand this topic. I mean, Bethesda could, in the future, cap it at 60 when consoles get faster, PCs get faster, things like that. It's not a problem if they want to do that, that is. I mean, a future anniversary edition, for example. But right now, if they've capped it at 30, it's because that's what today's hardware can cope with, on the consoles at least. To run it at 60 when the consoles couldn't handle it at 60 means you have a choice. Either run a really laggy game that's or just say they can't have it on the consoles. So what would you rather have? 30 frames per second and be able to play Starfield, or have to wait until you buy a PC to play it? Because that's the real argument here. So I don't think the 30 frames per second is actually a valid argument at all. I think, quite frankly, those kicking off about it are those people that want maximum performance on cheap hardware. They want the best of both worlds. If they want that, buy a PC, buy a good graphics card. That's my advice to them. Anyway, let me know what you think. I wasn't going to cover this topic, but I decided what the hell, I'd go do it anyway. But let me know what you think. You know, put your comments below, like, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you in the next one.